With all my heart, I love her. There's nobody else I think about, and I want to be with her my whole life.
On the 22nd of July 2021, John Tiedjen, at the age of 57, was released on bond after serving 32 years in prison for the murder of his old friend and roommate, Brian McGary. The two had grown up together and were said to have been like brothers. Then, just a month after his release in August, Tiedjen got married to Brian's sister. How does something like this happen? Hello everyone, I'm Kevin and welcome to Just Thought Lounge. Today we're going to take a look at a case that raises more than a few questions. It centers around a set of newly discovered photographs, about 87 of them in all, although even that number appears to be in dispute. It involves accusations of police misconduct, loads of suddenly missing evidence, conflicting forensics, and even a questionable confession. So without further delay, let's take a look. Our story takes place in Cleveland, Ohio, 1989. In the spring of that year, John Tiedjen and Brian McGary lived together as roommates in an upstairs apartment of a house in Cleveland's Slavic Village neighborhood. Tiedjen was 25 years old at the time and on probation for a rape conviction. His stepbrother Brian was only 18. After a night out together of heavy drinking and smoking marijuana, the two returned home. This was the evening of March 31st. The next morning, police were sent to the apartment that the two brothers shared and found Brian McGary curled up by the foot of his bed, dead. Brian had a 1-inch stab wound on his left chest, and he had a .22 caliber gunshot wound in between his eyes. There was a knife left in a pool of blood on his bed, and there was also a rifle of the same caliber laying across his feet. A neighbor in the complex reported seeing Tiedjen leave the apartment the night before, following the noise of a gunshot. Tiedjen visited that same neighbor the next day and said that he had actually found his stepbrother dead. In the immediate aftermath, Tiedjen told the police that he did not know how Brian had died, but that he thought that it was a suicide. And that is the same story that he told his neighbor, as well as the version that he told his mother later on that day. Tiedjen was heavily under the influence of alcohol and marijuana from the night out, so his recollection was a bit murky at best. Now, there are two versions of the events that evening, that of the prosecution and the defense. Let's examine the prosecution's version first. Tiedjen was interrogated by police from the 1st of April, when Brian was found, until the 4th of April. After these 3 days of questioning, Tiedjen offered a confession to the murder, but he was claiming that he did it in self-defense. On the 18th of the month, Tiedjen was now indicted for murder as well as a firearm specification, and only 45 days later he was found guilty by a jury and sentenced to 15 years to life for the murder with an additional 3 years for the firearm. The prosecution had successfully argued the events as dictated by Tiedjen's confession. He said that he and his stepbrother had returned home after drinking and had gotten into a heated argument. This was not terribly surprising, as Tiedjen's own mother would testify that she knew of arguments the two had had just a week earlier. According to the confession, the argument took place in the living room. Tiedjen then stated that Brian left the room to get a pistol, at which point Tiedjen grabbed a knife from the table. The two then struggled over the knife, at which point Brian was stabbed in the chest. Tiedjen then exited the confrontation and went to his bedroom. At this point, he heard 2 gunshots. He then grabbed the .22 caliber rifle that he owned and went into the hallway, where Brian confronted him with the pistol. Believing that Brian was about to shoot him, Tiedjen fired 1 shot at his brother. According to Tiedjen, Brian then fell back. Believing the confrontation was over, Tiedjen, he went to his bedroom and went to sleep. He awoke the next morning to find Brian by the bed with the .22 caliber rifle laying over his feet. Tiedjen does not call the police that morning. He instead goes to a neighbor's, Jeffrey Fleming's house, a few streets over. Fleming would testify that Tiedjen arrived visibly shaken. He tells Fleming that he believed his brother had committed suicide the night before. Later in the day, Fleming and Tiedjen would drive to another friend's home, that of Bob Pack. He would tell Pack the same story, that Brian had committed suicide. He believed his brother was upset over a girl. Pack would testify that Tiedjen also gave him a .32 caliber revolver while at his house that day and instructed him to get rid of it, which is bizarre behavior, all things considered. While at Pack's house, Tiedjen would make a series of phone calls. One of these calls would be to his mother, Alice. He tells his mother he was too intoxicated to remember what had happened. It was Alice that then makes the call to check out the apartment and turn her son into the police. When Brian's body was examined, the pathologist found no gunshot residue on his hands. They would also conclude that Brian was shot at a distance of approximately 2 feet. Both of these facts would seem to point away from suicide as the cause of death. This distance would later be amended down to 18 inches, but nonetheless, the prosecution argued that the shot was at a length long enough to support their version of events, that Brian did not commit suicide, but was shot in the hallway by his brother after a struggle. Tiedjen maintained his innocence throughout the decades of imprisonment that followed. He insisted the confession was forced. His defense argued that the police or the state manipulated crime scene evidence to convict him in 1989. The suicide claim appeared to receive further weight after Tiedjen's conviction when his appellate lawyers would learn that Brian was on prescription medication that carried with it an increased risk of suicidal tendencies. Additionally, there was a family history, given that Brian's father committed suicide several years earlier. Nonetheless, Tiedjen would lose several appeals over the years, that is, until a new discovery by his attorney in 2014 offered a glimpse of hope. About 87 photographs taken by police of the crime scene were found in the court file, though only 10 such photographs were ever made available to the defense attorneys and presented at trial. Tiedjen's lawyer in the 1989 case, Daniel Chaplin, said he was certain that 77 of the 87 photos were never handed over to him by the prosecution. He stated definitively that he was not aware that these additional photos existed at that time. Should these photos show any new evidence or indicate an alternative version of the crime, they could be considered exculpatory and earn Tiedjen a brand new trial. Anyone who has followed Making a Murderer on Netflix will be familiar with the legal basis on which this sits. The argument is based on the 1963 case Brady v. Maryland and commonly known as a Brady violation. When the prosecution withholds material, exculpatory evidence in a criminal proceeding, it violates the due process right of the defendant under the 14th Amendment to a fair trial. Tiedjen makes a clear accusation. He is arguing that the police or the state forced his confession and then manipulated the crime scene to show his guilt. Can the newly discovered photos prove that the crime scene was staged? We start with a pair of eyeglasses. Tiedjen's glasses were presented in one quite incriminating photograph on the floor of the apartment next to a puddle of Brian's blood. Discarded in this fashion, their placement would seem to support the theory that Brian was killed after a struggle with Tiedjen. In a second set of photographs, however, Tiedjen's glasses are pictured resting not on the floor, but on a nearby coffee table. Tiedjen's lawyer would argue that the police moved the eyeglasses to the floor next to the blood in order to stage the scene. Resting next to Brian's body in one photograph and clearly visible poking out of the top of Brian's pocket was a piece of paper. A note, perhaps? Could the suicide argument presented by Tiedjen now be supported by the discovery of a potential suicide note? Tiedjen's defense attorney was insistent that he did not know of its existence. Additionally, the prosecution could not say with any certainty whether the evidence was ever handed over to the defense. Stephen Dever, the 1989 prosecutor, stated that while he remembered the case generally, he could only testify as to what my custom or practice was in turning over evidence. Essentially, that it was his practice to do this as legally obligated. Not exactly a confidence-inspiring statement. What else can we see in the photos? Well, one photograph shows a lady's purse sitting in Brian's bedroom at the time that his body was discovered. A jacket from an unknown person is shown hung over a chair in the living room. Court documents state that defense counsel was again completely unaware of the presence of any additional people in the apartment, and they were therefore unable to pursue any investigation into an alternative suspect. The purse left in the photo is now accepted to be that of Brian's ex-girlfriend. Police reports show that the girlfriend contacted police a few days after the murder to request to enter the apartment and retrieve her purse. She was then let into the apartment and allowed to do so. There is no record of her entering the scene or other documentation to outline how she was escorted through. Police also scheduled interviews with Brian's ex-girlfriend, but never included any of her statements in the case file. Here we add another layer to this evidence. In addition to the belongings depicted in the apartment at the time of the murder, a new witness came forward that would also place a man and a woman at the apartment. The witness came forward back in 2002, well before the photos were discovered. This person gave sworn statements that seemed to counter that of the existing witness testimony. They said instead of seeing Tiedjen leave the apartment that night after hearing gunshots, they reported seeing two individuals, a man and a woman, rush out after the gunshots and jump into a black truck. Could this have been the ex-girlfriend and new boyfriend, leaving in a rush and forgetting their items inside? So we have a witness that the police have failed to locate. We also have photos suggesting the presence of other individuals in the apartment, a potential suicide note, and the majority of crime scene photos missing from the discovery in the case. And it gets worse. In the 2017 hearings in which Tiedjen initially argued for a new trial based on the new evidence, all 87 photos were submitted to the court for consideration. That number includes the 10 original photos from the 1989 trial and the newly discovered 77 images. By June 2019, when the follow-up hearing was held, these photos had gone missing. None of the new photos could be located. 2 of the original 10 photos were apparently reprinted and interspersed into some of Tiedjen's court filings and have therefore been retained. But, according to the court in 2019, these 2 images do not depict the originals in any amount of detail. In fact, they are described as most closely resembling ink blots, so not much help there. Dennis Murphy, the Cleveland police detective that investigated the 1989 case, submitted an affidavit in July 2017 that stated 43 crime scene photos were taken on the day that Brian was found. An additional 25 photos were then taken the day after Tiedjen confessed on the 6th of April. So that gives us a total of 68, not 87. But also, why the additional 25 after the confession? Seems convenient, right? And when did the ex-girlfriend enter to retrieve her things? Sometime within that gap? Murphy was deposed by Tiedjen's defense counsel in September of 2017, 2 months after he signed a sworn affidavit about the 2 photo sessions. Murphy, now bedridden from an illness, refused to confirm any of the statements that he swore to in July. There remains one potentially key piece of evidence found in the photos to consider, and it may directly impact the forensic assessment in this case. A photo shows that Brian had a piece of fabric wrapped around his hand. If Brian had held the rifle in his fabric-wrapped hand, it would explain why his fingerprints were not found on the gun. Local news had reported that Tiedjen's fingerprint was found on the stock of the rifle. It is unclear if this is true. But none of his blood was found, and Tiedjen would tell the press that there was no further physical evidence linking him to the scene. I had no powder burns, no gunshot residue, no blood, no cuts, no scrapes, nothing on my person or my clothing. A crime scene reconstruction expert, Scott Roeder from the Cleveland-based Evidence Room, has seen the new photos. Roeder believes that the photographs show that the gun that fired the fatal bullet was pressed against Brian's forehead and not more than 2 feet away. He concludes that the version of events prosecutors presented at trial does not match the evidence. Roeder has also presented a clear explanation as to why no gunshot residue would appear on Brian's hands, despite what he sees as a suicide. The police, instead of utilizing a paper product to wrap Brian's hands before analysis, chose to wrap his hands in clear plastic. This material, Roeder says, would have removed the gunshot residue from his skin. The prosecution's case is no longer looking very strong, but they do have a signed confession, and that is difficult to ignore. Tiedjen claims that he was forced into a confession following 3 days of interrogation, and context here is important. Tiedjen was on probation for a previous conviction. It was a rape conviction, so certainly not a point in his favor, but nonetheless, he was at risk of immediate return to prison for even the smallest offense, and at risk of increased punishment for any potential wrongdoing. Murphy told Tiedjen that his fingerprints were found on the gun, and again, unclear if that is true. He told him that due to his previous conviction, he would be going to prison for life for the murder, but that he, Murphy, could get him off on a less severe manslaughter charge if only he confessed that day. Murphy said he believed that Brian was killed in self-defense, that the two had argued and struggled in the living room, Brian had retreated into his bedroom to retrieve a gun, and Tiedjen shot him from the hallway. Tiedjen simply did not remember from being drunk and high on marijuana. His confession would reflect the scenario outlined by Murphy. Roeder would point out that there was no blood found in the hallway where Tiedjen stated he had shot Brian. Detectives also found several .22 caliber bullets in Brian's pants pocket, but no additional physical evidence linking Tiedjen to the scene. Is it possible that the confession was false? We've spent some time now pulling apart the state's case from 1989, but as we know, things are never so clear-cut. What other considerations are we missing that may be worth looking at? First, the timeline of the new photo discovery is a bit curious. Tiedjen admits to receiving these photos back in 2014. The next year, he hires an investigator to speak with Brian's ex-girlfriend about the items in the photos. It is not until October 2016, at least 2 years after viewing these new, potentially exonerating photos, that he files a motion in court to have them considered. Why did he wait? Setting that aside, what does the discovery of these new items definitively say about the murder scene? The eyeglasses depicted in one photo are also seen in another. But are these the same eyeglasses? It has not been confirmed whether Tiedjen, as people often do, owned 2 pairs. Also, the ex-girlfriend's purse and her boyfriend's jacket. That doesn't look good, but the fact that the items were in the apartment at the time of the murder does not necessarily mean that either one of the individuals who own them were in the apartment at that time. Or, for that matter, the photos themselves do not indicate that anyone was present at any point in time close to the murder taking place. The ex-girlfriend says they visited a few days before. Maybe they did. The police obviously had reason to believe that that was the case. So what do you think? These are the facts as I've found them. Tiedjen was granted a new trial on the 22nd of June, 2021, and had hearings beginning on the 31st of August. His new wife stands firmly beside him, supporting his case and pleading his innocence. Thanks so much for stopping by. My name is Kevin, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.